Welcome to Leaders Upgraded, the place where people who want to upgrade and fast track their career, their life, and their leadership journey tend to gather. I am your host, Tanvi Gautam, and I shall be speaking to the top 10% of the world's leading authors, CEOs, coaches, and thinkers to bring you some of the best and brilliant ideas to fast track your way to success. Would you like an upgrade? Let's do this.
Something I haven't shared with a lot of people is that when I began my PhD, my major was always going to be organizational behavior and human resource management. But my minor was not supposed to be information systems, it was supposed to be strategy. I was in love with this idea of studying strategy. After all, strategy is how you get from point A to B, and you make all the decisions about how you will allocate resources and the markets you'll play in. And of course, HR and organizational behavior people could benefit from that. So I went to my first PhD class on strategy, and the professor, who shall remain unnamed, was someone who made the subject so complicated that I dropped out and I decided to opt in for information systems instead. However, my love for strategy never went away, and I was always on a quest to find a teacher who would explain strategy to me in a manner that was intuitive, implementable, as well as fun. And I'm happy to say that the guest on our show today turned out to be just the teacher that I was looking for. So I'm really excited to welcome Jeroen Kruijenbrink, all the way from Netherlands. He's a strategy and leadership consultant and mentor. He's written a book called 1 Hour Strategy, which, don't let the title fool you, it is going to take more than 1 hour, as well as the strategy handbook. So welcome, Jeroen.
Thank you, Tanvi. Great introduction. And I feel sorry for you having had this experience, which is not uncommon. And if it's one of the reasons I do what I do.
Yeah, I think I try to think of it as how we have high school and college sweethearts, which didn't happen. And then when you have a midlife crisis, you go looking for them again sometimes.
Yeah.
I'm not saying anything about my real life. I'm just giving an analogy. I do storytelling,
Yeah.
for a living. So, all right. So let's talk about this topic because I think there's so much of clarification needed around different terms, the way companies are approaching it, and the topic for our
Mhm.
conversation is taking strategy beyond the ivory tower because I think a lot of people don't fully understand. They think it's this thing that happens inside the boardroom, and then the rest of us just run along and follow. So I know that you have shared earlier that your definition of strategy is an organization strategy is its unique way of creating sustainable value in the market, right? And that definition itself has so much to unpack in it. How I would love for you to tell us a little bit more on what is the simplest way for us to think about strategy without overcomplicating it.
Mhm.
Because I think one has to always balance that need for strategic depth at one end, because it is the strategy for the company, but the simplicity at the other end, where if people don't understand what's going on, it's not going to get implemented. So, where do you think we should start in this conversation?
Yes. Do you have 2 hours?
Yes.
Yeah. This is one of the fundamental issues that I've struggled with initially. My first career was as an academic, so I was teaching strategy and researching strategy, and increasingly felt dissatisfied. Like after a lecture for a group of students, I was dissatisfied because I thought, how is this useful? And the interesting thing, it was because it was too simple and too complex at the same time. Too simple in a sense, like the idea that you need a mission statement that'll resolve it, or a 2 by 2 matrix. There's lots of 2 by 2 frameworks like the SWOT, which is far too simplistic. The reality is not that simple. And on the other hand, there are so many different models that makes it very complicated and very complex, because how to combine all these different models. So strategy has become this kind of model exercise where you fill in one model after the other, and then magically you have a strategy. So my journey is very much around this simplicity and complexity, because on the one hand, you can't just keep it too simple, because strategy, no matter how you look at it, it is a complex topic by definition, because strategy is overarching the holistic picture, like the future picture of an organization. So that includes everything. So you can't just have like high level statements or a one page or a couple of slides. You need more depth as well. And you already referred to the definition that I used, an organization's way of sustainable value creation, of creating sustainable value. That in itself, if you can formulate that clearly and crisp, then that's the simple version. In a few lines, you can explain who are your customers, what are you doing for them, how you're creating value for them in a way that's also sustainable over time. But that in itself is not enough. And for that reason, I've spent a lot of time, especially 10 years ago when I wrote my first book, the Strategy Handbook, in opening up the black box of what is inside strategy. And the model I use there, the framework, is the strategy sketch. I know you have it ready as well, so maybe it's a good idea to share. Yes. So what you see here is on a single sheet, the 10 ingredients of strategy in a very simple way, in a structured, coherent way. I won't go in depth, but on the left side, resources and competences and partners, that's your means. On the right side, customers and needs and competitors, that's your market. The value proposition, that's basically the magic as your organization. You're connecting everything. Above the middle, you have revenue model, risk and cost. That's the money side. Below the middle, you have values and goals, organizational climate. That's the meaning side. And around it, you have the context, the trends and uncertainties, which creates momentum or not. So those 10 elements are everything you need if you think about strategy. And it's still a lot, of course, thinking about 10 elements, but it makes it contained, it makes it clear. And I use this in every training and every consulting engagement and coaching and in mentoring, because it's so useful to create a good understanding of what strategy is all about. And the interesting thing is you can use the single framework for basically every part of the strategy process. So to describe the status quo, to assess it, to ideate and come up with new ideas, also to look at, to create a integrative, coherent future picture, to monitor. And the other thing is you can use it at every level in an organization. You can look at a department, the corporation, and even at the individual level, it makes sense. And in this way, even though you have 10 elements, it is in a coherent one framework, which you just use throughout the process and throughout the organization. And that's my way of keeping it simple in terms of tools and process, and an aligned model, and at the same time making it detailed enough to really pay attention to all the important ingredients of strategy. So that's really the core of how I work. And in the 1 hour strategy that you refer to, I've even further simplified it from 10 to 6 elements. But the idea is the same. You need one framework throughout an organization containing the key ingredients. Then you can actually strategize, I think, the way it's supposed to be.
So I suppose if we were to start with that canvas, that sketch that you have, would I be correct in assuming that one needs to have clarity on each of those elements, and strategy will then depend on which elements we are pulling on and how to create a unique recipe for our company that makes sense? But we should have an understanding of all 10 elements so that we know what the options are. We understand which direction these might go in, so that if we have to change something, at least we have the same sheet that we are singing from, and those combinations come together and shift and morph as is needed. Is that
not that that's how it is? And I think what is important is clarity on all 10. That's one. The other thing is also quality in all 10, because if you just have clarity and it's just bad, that doesn't work. So all 10 needs to be at least some quality level. And then the third thing is alignment. I think a perfect strategy is one where all these 10 elements are aligned.
Yes.
That's a fiction, of course. It's never, and it's a moving target, so it will change all the time. But that's the process, is making sure you have clarity on all 10, that the quality is good and that they are aligned. I think that's the main challenge for strategy for any organization.
Clarity, quality, and alignment. 3 metrics for all those 10 spots, sitting and pulling together the picture for yourself.
Yes.
But I want to talk about this word value creation. Particularly, what do we think of as value creation? What do we really even mean by that? That's one. And do you think that definition has changed in any way when we think about value creation in an era of purpose-led businesses? Because a lot of companies now are talking about being a purpose-driven organization. So could you just unpack that a little bit for us, the idea of value creation?
Yeah, I think the idea has never changed. And if you look at the oldest organization you could look at, I think their reason of existence is value creation. They create a product, a service, something that a group of people, a group of organization, or even one person or a one organization values. So I think that the fundamental reason why we have organizations is that they create value beyond what an individual can do. So that has never changed. I think what has changed is rediscovering this. Is like for a long time, let's say the last century, the focus in organizations was on efficiency, uh, profits, growth, making money, basically seeing the organization as a machine producing money. And I'm putting it a little bit too black and white here, but that's the main theories, the main goals of organizations have become that. And I think what we see now finally rediscover is, okay, that's not all. That's maybe not even the most important thing. It is not the most important thing. It is creating value. And we see that. I'm very happy that we are rediscovering this. And whether we call it purpose, whether we call it why, contribution, impact, I don't mind. Most important is that more and more people are recognizing that's the only way forward. And the interesting thing is that has an external orientation and kind of a giving orientation. What do we mean? What's our meaning? What's our contribution to someone's problem or to something's problem? And yeah, so I'm just happy. It could go much faster. And part of it is still lip service, is adopting the language and still having the same drive to just make money, grow, and profits at the expense of anything else. But I do think there's a change happening. Finally, yeah, rediscovering what I think organizations were for in the first place.
So, in the first session that I was in, that class where I thought I was going to be a strategy minor, but I wasn't, there was this conversation about Joseph Schumpeter and his creative destruction in economics, which I found fascinating because somebody was acknowledging something about destruction and not just always creation. Do you think organizations can destroy value as well? Is that something that companies can end up doing? Hopefully inadvertently, but is that
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think some of them intentionally is like if your real drive is to make more money, I think the organization is aligned not to create value. Then the creating value might be a kind of an unintended consequence. But at its heart, you are creating products that are not as good as they could be. Because the interest, if you focus on value creation, for instance, you would focus on very high quality products that last. In many industries, that's not the main driver. It's
no?
a product that breaks down as soon as reasonably possible so that people replace it and buy new stuff. So that's
Yeah.
I think that's a different intention. If value creation is your intention, you're truly taking customer needs and demands and aspirations into account, and the rest is secondary.
I also wonder whether, in some ways, in the age of technology, what we describe as value creation has shifted, whereas earlier there may have been a focus on creating products that last forever. God knows my grandma's refrigerator is still running, believe it or not. But with
Mm.
the iPhone, for instance, this idea that you have to constantly keep upgrading it, and that value creation lies, software upgrade, the feature upgrade, and we have just come to accept that it's no longer this idea of I've got a product and now it's this happily ever after relationship with the products. That value creation is actually shorter cycles of getting upgraded in terms of features versus durability, which may have been another metric of value creation in
Mhm.
the past.
Yeah, which is probably, I think, one of the big problems in Western or capitalist society. Or maybe we always want more. We want to gather more and newer and faster, and companies respond to that. So it's always an interaction between what consumers buy and what companies offer. So there's responsibility on both sides. I think we have an endless need for new stuff, and I think that's something. If you think in terms of from value to values, something where I think we need to learn that okay, there's an end to this.
Yeah.
Growth is not the final model. It can't go on forever. There's a limit to that. And which
Yeah.
is very challenging. And there's just a minority of people who are able to do that, reduce their consumption. I'm doing my best personally, not there yet, but I think that's, and you can still create value, and there can still be like a good financial logic underneath it and room for business. But it's a pretty fundamental mindset thing that I don't see changing yet so much.
Mm, mm. I get the feeling that Europe is slightly ahead of the rest of the world when it comes to this, or at least so is
I
my
hope.
belief,
Yeah.
but I don't have data on that. So, one of the questions that I often ponder with is that given the pace of change having sped up over the last few years, and certainly we saw that with the pandemic, that we live in a world of disruption, how good is your strategy? How adaptable is this idea of strategy when we think
Mhm.
about long term strategy? In a world where there's constant change, what is the relationship between adaptability and
Mhm.
strategy? How often should one be revisiting this idea, if at all? I know I feel like the days of the 5 year plans are definitely behind us for sure. But
Mhm.
how should we thinking about the longevity of our strategy
Mhm.
in
I
today's
think
age?
one thing is important to realize that the idea that everything goes faster and is more uncertain, more complex is not from the last years. It's not from the last decade. It's not even from the last centuries. It's a universal feeling of mankind. There is, I think, a clay tablet from 3,000 years ago expressing a similar kind of concern, like everything is getting out of hand. I think that's one a very important thing to realize, that even though everyone says things are more complex, faster, and uncertain, that may not necessarily be uh, always true. So I think that really helps already put things in perspective. Because of course there is change, but we also have the technology and organizational forms that are able to deal with the change. So maybe we're even better equipped to deal with change than ever before, and maybe the fast change is less of a problem than it was like 50 years ago.
Mm,
This is also interesting because if you look at the origins of strategy and business strategy, not the art of war going back like 2000 years ago, it's the early 1970s. Before it, we called it business policy and planning. And if you read early articles in long range planning, which was one of, let's say, the strategy journal of that time, like from the early 70s, it's exactly this question, like strategy in an age of uncertainty, of complexity. So that's more than 50 years ago. The And of course, I think what the problem is, we have made strategy into this very long linear process with a lot of time spent on analysis, a lot of reliance on prediction and trends. We don't really need that. But we can't go the other way fully, because if we become fully adaptive, we lose the whole point of strategy, because the whole point of strategy is to provide some stability in a changing environment. That has always been the role of strategy in
mm,
business. In terms of my I don't know, there is no kind of single timeline. Is it 5 years, 3 year, 1 year? That all depends, and there's
mm,
different horizons. Some things you need to probably revisit every month, other things every half year, every year, every 5 years. So that depends. But I think the main mantra, if you like, that you need is monitor actively and change reluctantly. So be
mm,
very keen on seeing what is changing inside your organization, outside your organization, and then always think: is this relevant for me? Does it impact the rest? Do I need to change, or can I stay on course? Can I stick to my strategy, or should I change? And then be reluctant with changing, because if you change it all the time, you lose the whole point of strategy, and you're ending up in this day-to-day ad hoc responsive behavior which you were supposed to get out of in the first place. So monitor
mm,
actively, change reluctantly. And that's again where the strategy sketch that you showed becomes very relevant, because if you look at these 10 elements, even in the back of your mind, when you read the newspaper, when you hear things, when you go to conferences, whatever, you can always think, hey, is something changing? Look at my customers, look at my competitors, look at my resources, the partners. Has something changed? If so, does it impact the rest? If not, we can keep our strategy. If so, we probably have to adjust it. And adjusting it doesn't mean completely replacing it, because that's the old idea. Like, we have a strategy, and then after 3 or 5 years, we start again. We start fresh from scratch, we start again. But it's much more an incremental change, where you can change one element without changing the rest. If you, for instance, if there's a new technology, it doesn't mean you have to revisit the market you're serving, maybe not even the products, not your revenue model, not the rest of the organization. So it's, once again, monitor actively, change reluctantly, and think about it as from this sketch perspective, different elements that can change while others can stay similar or unchanged for quite a while.
When I first came across the distinction between forecasting and foresight is when I think the conversation became very interesting for me, because I think somewhere what I'm hearing you say in terms of monitoring different aspects speaks to the whole foresight element of strategy creation, adaptation, isn't it?
Yeah, because you try to find out like early warning signals, be very keen on changes without trying to predict anything, because I think that's only possible in very stable, predictable environments. And if you stay the same as well, and that's paradoxically the situation where strategy is least relevant, because if you're in a mature industry and you just want to stay there, yeah, there's not much strategizing. You just continue what you do. You make very small changes, perhaps.
Yeah.
So yes, foresight, I think, is much more important than the forecasting.
You might have heard about Professor Ashwath Damodaran. He's a finance professor in New York, and he wrote this article, and he's been saying this for a while, about companies learning to act their age and recognizing where they are in the growth cycle and then adapting the strategies accordingly, versus just picking a strategy because it looks like everybody else is following it, or it seems like it might be a good one. But that match between where you are in the growth cycle and the maturity of the market, and then choosing, it sounds like the strategy needs a strategy in its own right. You work with so many leaders and organizations. You read, write, speak on this topic. What do you think are some of the common overlooked assumptions that leaders make about strategy that they should correct? And how can one challenge some of those assumptions constructively? Are there any 2 or 3 things that you see again and again, and you're like, see, they're going again? There's
10. And that's one of another book I wrote is Unlearning Strategy, which is basically like a collection of articles I wrote for Forbes earlier on, like the 10 myths. And let me just, from the top of my mind, recollect a few. One of them is that strategy should be made by the top. There's even in academic journals definitions of strategy that say basically that activities or those activities that are done by the top of the organization, which I think is a complete nonsense definition. Because the problem is if you just have the top involved in strategy, because then you create this boardroom reality. You create a problem between those who create the strategy and those who have to execute it. There's a translation problem, a commitment problem, an engagement problem, many problems if that assumption is still followed. I think another myth or assumption is that it can be derived from data. And the strategy can be derived from data, because there's so much emphasis on data collection, trends, predictions. And the question is really, how valuable is that and for whom? Because also, especially that is only relevant if you have no intention of changing anything, and if you're in a very mature industry that is not going to change for a couple of years, because data, especially quantitative data, reflects the past, and it's always an extrapolation of what happened in the past, and it doesn't say anything about the future. Plus, there's many more ingredients in strategy that are relevant. One is also preferences. What do we want as people? We're creating it together with people. What do we want? Which you can't derive from data, because it's subjective. It's based on their values, their aspirations, So there's much more an emotional, social side to strategy that is underemphasized. Maybe a third one is I'm a strategy consultant. I think a myth is also that strategy can be created by consultants. And it's also a quote that I used from Henry Mintzberg in yet another book called Strategy Consulting. So we're covering all my books here. It's like any executive that hires a consultant to create strategy for them should be fired. And I do agree with that, because as a consultant, I cannot create a strategy for an organization. I can create it on behalf of them. So I often see myself more as a ghostwriter. So I hear, I talk to them, I engage with them, and then can formulate what they have said. But a
Right.
consultant cannot give you the strategy because they don't understand. I don't understand an organization well enough. I don't understand an industry well enough, because I'm not in there. I'm a consultant. I'm not in some manufacturing business. I'm not an accountant. I'm not a bank. So
Yes.
they understand. So you can't, as a consultant, you can't create a strategy for an organization, or at least not a good one.
Yeah. I think even though my work is not directly in strategy, but I sometimes get called in to discuss how strategy can be translated for the purposes of execution so that alignment can get created. And in my experience, strategy assumption that it is, of course, those 10 elements and putting them together in a unique pattern that works for you and your value creation. But there is that translation piece for the people so that they get it. So I end up doing a lot of work on using storytelling, for example, for translating strategy, whether it's for go to market or whether it is to make sure that the organization between the headquarters and the region are able to speak in a manner that goes beyond the numbers and the map. And I think one thing that has always struck me as very interesting about your work is that you are somebody who's almost at the intersection of strategy and human psychology. You've been talking about the soulful strategy as well. What do you think are some of the psychological elements of strategy creation or execution that can come in the way? Are there any biases? Are there any processes when it comes to the psychological aspect of strategy that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think I'm glad you're recognizing that, and it's also what we're with our company Strategy Inc. We're really focusing on human-centered strategy, which is maybe not just a psychological part, but really embracing like our human beings for fully what they are, not like a left brain rational robot, but people with feelings, with emotions, but focusing on the psychological side. I think there's probably every bias that you can find. And I know if you search for it, like there's 100 of them, like biases and heuristics that are not so valid. So probably all of them are relevant. In an earlier post, I've separated them into biases, bubbles, and blind spots. Biases being these distorted judgments from like opinions getting in the way or proximity, prejudice. So there's all kind of cognitive limitations that we have. So those are biases. Bubbles. We are all in bubbles. In our industry bubble, in our profession bubble, in our family bubble, in our friends bubble, level of education, income, and that's not just a social media thing that has been always there. Like for as long as there are people, there are bubbles. And being aware of those bubbles, I think, is very important because you realize that you have a one-sided view. So there's biases, which are built in our cognitive limitations as human beings. There's bubbles, which are the settings we're in, and there's blind spots. There's always things because we focus on because we look in one direction, we miss what's behind us. We don't have a 360-degree view because we have to focus. Our attention has to go to few things, so we will not see a lot of things. So biases, bubbles, and blind spots that I think play a big role in business and are a big cause of bad strategic decisions. And my solution for that is bringing in very different people in the room with different levels in the organization, different roles, different levels of experience, different backgrounds. So the more diverse, the better you're able to deal with the biases, bubbles, and blind spots because everyone sees something else. It's of course not a perfect solution, but it's the best we can. Have a multi-perspective, diverse group involved in strategy development and execution.
Right. Which brings me to a final question as we start wrapping this up, because what sort of a podcast host am I going to be if I don't ask a question about AI? And actually, you have actually even got yourself an AI twin, I saw, that got
Yes.
launched, which maybe I should try and host a podcast with your twin and see what comes of
Let's
some of
see.
the
There will be a video version very soon as well. By the way,
Oh,
this is still the real me, and I'm sure you will see the difference still.
you shouldn't have said that. We could have pretended this was your twin and had
Uh,
some fun with that. But
Sorry.
anyway, so how is, with AI coming in, how is that changing anything in the field
Mhm.
of strategy? For one, I think, is it being able to help overcome any of the biases, bubbles, and blind spots, perhaps? And
Mhm.
when we are relying on AI, perhaps for strategy creation or execution or evaluation, as the case might be, is there still room for human intuition? What are your
Mhm.
thoughts about the interaction between AI and
Mhm.
strategy?
The honest answer is I don't know.
Mm,
Because I'm not an AI expert, and I think it's far too early to see how this is going to develop.
mm,
Um, but I do have thoughts or hopes about this, which is I think generally with every technology, it's either for good or for bad. You can use it for in both directions. What I truly hope is we are using AI to take off, let's say, the load that as human beings we don't have to do. So everything that's analytical, everything that can be created based on previous data. So,
mhm,
and that's what in the end what is done. There is everything that has been said. And that's also how my AI works. It's based on everything that I've written and said in podcasts and books and articles and posts before, and using that in a very creative way to come up with answers that I have never given. I think that's
mm,
where AI becomes very is a very useful thing. And if we use that to complement the thing that AI cannot so much do, and that's the relational part. That's the um, giving meaning to something. It's
mhm,
intuition, judgment. So all of that, what makes us, let's say, accept our really cognitive abilities. I think everything else. So what I hope is that instead of further pushing that to the side, because I think that's what we've done in the past century, like kind of dehumanize strategy as far as we could by making
mm,
it rational, analytical, objective, and then calculating the decisions, which of course doesn't work. If we don't not go that path further, but then really focus on what humans can do and have a good synergy, a symbiosis of what AI can do or what technology can do and what humans can do. And if that's the direction, I think then that's a great, powerful combination.
mm. I love that. I love that framing. For me, when I have been using AI to think about what's the strategic narrative that we can create around the strategy that we have, and at least in those experiments, I have found it's come up with some very interesting combinations of the metaphors and the way we could talk about
Mhm.
uh, strategy itself. So, just as we wind up, what's the next new exciting thing that you're working on or looking forward to, Jörn?
Yeah, next. So with our company Strategy Inc., we have been starting to train other consultants. We started last year. We're now running our third cohort, which is very exciting because it means we're helping other people to help more companies.
Mhm.
But the most exciting thing now, I think, is we're also developing what we call a strategic competency framework, helping people in organizations at every level. So whether you're an employee, a manager, an executive, helping you develop strategic competencies, because I think there's a big void. There's many different leadership competency frameworks for personal development, for let's say improving your career, in which strategic thinking is one small competence. And I
Mm,
think that's really a very important one because in a time and industry where there is a lot of change, I think strategy is the most important competence because it is about staying abreast on what is changing and rethinking where we should move, and not just at the top but at every level. So being able to offer like assessment training and also like embedding that in people's day-to-day work That I think is very exciting, because I think virtually every organization in the world would need that if you truly want to create a company of strategic thinkers, which I think we need, and which it's kind of going back to the 1 Hour Strategy, the subtitle of the book.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that with us. And thank you for finding the time. And of course, we will be posting your LinkedIn profile and other details for our listeners in the show notes. And all I can say is that if anyone is even remotely wanting to understand how to demystify strategy and its implementation, that following Jeroen is something that you will never regret. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. And it's very easy to follow me because there's just one Jeroen Kruijenbrink. So if you spell it correctly, you will find me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
That concludes this episode of Leaders Upgraded. But wait, your journey is just getting started. Go to www.leadersupgraded.com for more insights, more inspiration, and more tools to continue the journey. And if you have someone who you would like to nominate for the podcast, or a particular topic you'd like us to cover, then also visit www.leadersupgraded.com and let us know. If you like this episode, please do share it. Please do subscribe to the podcast. And I look forward to continued upgrades with you. Take care.